The Watergate scandal occurred during Richard Nixon's presidency. The episode involved a break-in at the DNC, Democratic National Committee, offices in Watergate, and a cover-up by the White House and President Nixon. Stay as we examine one of the major political scandals that took down the presidency. What happened? When people use the term Watergate, they typically mean the Watergate Scandal. The name was derived from the Watergate complex in Washington, D.C. The Democratic Party's headquarters were housed at the Watergate premises. Several men working to re-elect U.S. President Richard Nixon decided to spy on the Democratic Party. They devised a plan to break into the Democratic Party offices in the Watergate building. On May 11, 1972, they broke into the offices, photographed secret documents, and wiretapped the phone. They initially got away with it. They attempted to break in again on June 17, 1972. They were apprehended this time. Ideally, you'd expect such action to go with strict punishment, right? Well, later, we'll inform you of how President Nixon and his allies worked tirelessly to cover this up. Police captured 5 burglars at the DNC, Democratic National Committee, headquarters at the Watergate complex. 4 of them previously worked for the Central Intelligence Agency, CIA, against Fidel Castro in Cuba. The arrest was published the next morning in the Washington Post by Alfred E. Louis, Carl Bernstein, and Bob Woodward, the last 2 a pair of relatively inexperienced young reporters assigned to unglamorous assignments. Bernstein will cover Virginia politics on the go, while Woodward, who is still new to the post, will cover minor criminal activity. Soon after, Woodward and Bernstein, as well as FBI, Federal Bureau of Investigation, agents identified 2 co-conspirators in the burglary. E. Howard Hunt Jr., a former high-ranking CIA, Central Intelligence Agency official recently appointed to the White House staff, and G. Gordon Liddy, a former FBI Federal Bureau of Investigation agent serving as a lawyer for CREEP, a committee to re-elect the president, which raised money for Richard Nixon's campaign for 1972 re-election. At the time of the break-in, Liddy was supervising a similar, but unfinished, attempt to get into and surveil the headquarters of George S. McGovern, the Democratic contender for President of the United States in 1972. You know what Nixon did wrong? The Watergate Hotel was only breached once by him. If only he'd done it every day, there'd be no problem with it, right? Yes, you did get it, but it's all your fault now. Woodward and Bernstein. The Washington Post Bob Woodward and Carl Bernstein were investigating the incident. Throughout the 1972 presidential campaign, Woodward and Bernstein received leaks from an unnamed source they dubbed Deep Throat, who was subsequently identified as FBI Deputy Director W. Mark Felt, SR, only 30 years later. They published a steady stream of scoops proving Richard Nixon Associates' direct involvement in Watergate activities, that the Watergate wiretapping and break-in were financed with illegally laundered campaign contributions, and that the Watergate bugging incident stemmed from a massive campaign of political spying and sabotage conducted on behalf of U.S. President Richard Nixon's re-election and directed by officials of the White House in a blockbuster opinion piece. President Nixon had provided hush money to the burglars to keep them quiet. The cover-up. The team working for President Nixon put in a lot of effort to keep the break-in a secret. Richard Nixon denied any knowledge of the acts and maintained that none of his people were engaged. He also stated that he had no idea that they were taking place. In November of 1972, he won re-election as president, largely thanks to his ability to keep his name out of the scandal. If you subscribe to our channel, you will be able to learn about incredible events that have occurred in the past and even in the present that you were not aware of. Additionally, you need to enable post notifications. As you can guess at this point, the issue eventually got out. After all, nothing stays hidden forever. But what you should be interested in is how Nixon handled it at that point. Did he deny involvement? Did he implicate others for his wrongs? Stay with us, and we'll answer these burning questions. The smoking gun, the tapes. Despite rising suspicions that President Nixon was involved, there was no concrete evidence. To impeach the president, Congress needed hard proof. On June 23, 1972, the president directed the FBI Federal Bureau of Investigation to halt its investigation through channels. This directive later disclosed in what became known as the Nixon tapes, secret recordings of U.S. President Richard Nixon's phone calls and talks in the Oval Office, became the smoking gun, indicating that the president had been involved in a criminal cover-up from the start. Investigators requested the tapes. When Richard Nixon refused to turn over the tapes, the Supreme Court intervened and compelled him to do so. The smoking gun was the cassettes. They clearly demonstrated Nixon's involvement in the cover-up. Nixon's resignation. With the release of the smoking gun tapes, U.S. President Richard Nixon's political career was over. The Congress was going to impeach him. Rather than be impeached, President Nixon chose to resign. On August 9, 1974, President Richard Nixon became the first president of the United States to resign from office. Vice President Gerald Ford succeeded him. President Nixon did not face criminal charges because incoming President Ford pardoned him. However, many of the other men involved were prosecuted. For example, a total of 48 government officials were found guilty of crimes. Many of them served time in jail. We are quite grateful that you spent some of your time sharing another mystery with us. Watching the video titled Top 5 Genovese Crime Family Bosses in History will provide you with information regarding one of the biggest crime families in the history of Italy. They committed several heinous crimes in New York and many parts of America. You definitely should check it out. We hope to run into you again soon.